The late September sun cast dappled shadows through the maple leaves as 13-year-old Nathan Mitchell wandered along Liberty Park's winding trails. The crisp autumn air carried the sweet scent of fallen leaves and distant barbecue smoke, reminding him of countless weekends spent here with his family. His father, Captain James Mitchell, had been patrolling these grounds for over 15 years, a dedication that made the park feel like an extension of their home. Nathan's sneakers crunched against the gravel path as he ventured deeper into the less crowded areas of the park. He loved these quiet moments, when the distant laughter of playing children faded into the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a blue jay. His father would be somewhere nearby, probably checking on the eastern section where teenagers sometimes caused trouble after school. The familiar weight of his backpack, filled with his dad's favorite turkey sandwich and fresh apple pie his mom had baked that morning, bounced rhythmically against his spine. He planned to surprise his father with lunch, a tradition they'd started when Nathan was just 7, though back then his mother had to drive him to the park. As he rounded a bend in the trail, the air seemed to shift. The cheerful atmosphere of the main park area felt distant now, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Through the trees, Nathan spotted a police officer he didn't recognize, leaning against a weathered wooden bench. Something about the officer's posture made Nathan's stomach tighten, a sensation he couldn't quite explain but had learned to trust from his father's teachings about intuition. The officer's badge caught the sunlight, momentarily blinding Nathan as he approached. He considered turning back, taking the longer route around the pond to find his father, but that felt like admitting to fear. His dad had always taught him that police officers were there to help, to protect. Still, his feet seemed to move more slowly with each step, as if warning him to reconsider. Continued through detailed narrative building tension and atmosphere. Chapter 2. The confrontation officer Derek Walsh had been having a terrible day long before he spotted the teenager walking alone through his patrol area. His divorce papers had arrived that morning. His ex-wife's lawyer had called about missed alimony payments, and his flask was running dangerously low. The sight of a kid wandering where he shouldn't be, at least in Walsh's mind, sparked something ugly inside him. "Hey!" Walsh's voice cut through the air like a whip. "What do you think you're doing back here?" Nathan's heart jumped into his throat, but he forced himself to remain calm. The strong scent of alcohol reached his nostrils as the officer approached, making his nose wrinkle involuntarily. "I'm just heading to meet my father, sir. He works here." Walsh's laugh had a cruel edge to it. "Oh yeah? And who might Daddy be?" His hand rested heavily on Nathan's shoulder, fingers digging in just enough to hurt. "Captain Mitchell," Nathan replied, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. James Mitchell. The mention of the captain's name only seemed to anger Walsh further. His grip tightened, and Nathan could feel each individual finger pressing into his flesh. "Captain Mitchell's kid. Huh? Think that makes you special? Think you can just wander wherever you want?" Walsh's fingers dug deeper into Nathan's shoulder as he reached down with his free hand, fumbling with something in his patrol bag. The metallic clink of glass against glass made Nathan's heart race faster. He watched in horror as Walsh produced a brown bottle, its label partially obscured by a paper bag. "Let's see how special you really are," Walsh sneered, his breath heavy with the sour stench of alcohol. "Maybe it's time you learned what it's like to be one of us regular folks." He thrust the bottle toward Nathan's face, the glass cold against his lips. Nathan tried to turn away, but Walsh's grip was like iron, holding him in place as tears began to well in his eyes. The sound of running footsteps crunching on gravel barely registered in Nathan's terror-filled mind. But the voice that followed, deep, commanding, and achingly familiar, cut through his fear like a blade through fog. "Get your hands off my son!" Captain James Mitchell's voice thundered across the clearing. Nathan had never heard his father sound so angry, yet there was something else in his tone, a tremor of fear that made him seem more human than Nathan had ever realized. Walsh's grip loosened instantly, the bottle dropping from his hand and shattering against a rock. The sharp smell of beer mixed with the earthiness of the forest floor as Captain Mitchell closed the distance between them in what seemed like two massive strides. His normally pristine uniform was slightly disheveled, evidence of his sprint through the park when he'd spotted the situation unfolding. "Dad," Nathan choked out, his voice barely a whisper as he stumbled toward his father's protective presence. James caught him with one arm while keeping his other hand extended toward Walsh, who had taken several unsteady steps backward. "Sir, I was just—" Walsh began, but James cut him off with a look so fierce it seemed to physically push the drunk officer back another step. "Save it," James growled, his hand moving to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Captain Mitchell. I need immediate backup at the East Trail Junction. Officer in need of disciplinary action. Code 3. The radio crackled with confirmation as James kept his eyes locked on Walsh, who had begun to realize the full magnitude of his mistake. Nathan pressed his face into his father's uniform shirt, breathing in the familiar scent of laundry detergent and his dad's aftershave. The comfort of it made his shoulders shake as the tears he'd been holding back finally broke free. James's arm tightened around him protectively, but his voice remained steady as he addressed Walsh. "Officer Walsh, you are hereby relieved of duty pending investigation. Place your weapon and badge on the ground, slowly, and step back." The authority in James's voice left no room for argument, even as the sound of approaching sirens began to fill the air. Walsh's face had drained of color, the alcohol-induced bravado replaced by dawning horror. "Captain, please. I didn't know he was your son. I was just trying to teach him a lesson about—" His words trailed off as James's expression darkened further. "A lesson?" James's voice was dangerously quiet. "You wanted to teach my 13-year-old son a lesson by forcing alcohol down his throat? Is that what you're telling me, Officer Walsh?" The sirens grew louder as two patrol cars pulled into the nearby parking area, their tires spitting gravel. Walsh's shoulders slumped in defeat as he slowly removed his badge and weapon, placing them on the ground with trembling hands. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez emerged from their vehicles, taking in the scene with professional efficiency. "Take him in," James ordered, his voice still tight with controlled rage. "Full report on my desk within the hour. And get a breathalyzer ready. I want his blood alcohol level documented immediately." As Walsh was led away, James finally turned his full attention to Nathan, kneeling down to look his son in the eye. The fierce captain was gone, replaced by a father whose hands shook slightly as he checked his son for injuries. "Are you okay, buddy? Did he hurt you?" Nathan nodded, then shook his head, unsure which question he was answering. "I'm okay," he managed, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I was just trying to bring you lunch." He gestured weakly at his backpack, which had fallen to the ground during the confrontation. James pulled him into a proper hug then, and Nathan could feel his father's heart racing. "I'm so sorry, Nathan. I'm so sorry this happened. You did everything rig. You stayed calm. You were brave, and you gave me time to get here." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. James kept his arm around Nathan's shoulders as they walked back toward the main area of the park. The late afternoon sun had taken on a different quality now, the shadows longer and somehow more ominous. Nathan could feel his father's hand trembling slightly where it rested against his shoulder, a detail that struck him as more frightening than anything Walsh had done. He'd never seen his father shake before. "Mom's going to be worried," Nathan said quietly, breaking the heavy silence between them. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, higher than usual, like he was 7 again instead of 13. James pulled out his phone with his free hand, his fingers hovering over the keypad for a moment. "Sarah needs to know," he agreed, his voice still rough with emotion. "But I don't want to scare her more than necessary. Let me handle this, okay?" As James dialed, Nathan noticed a small crowd gathering near the park's main pavilion. News traveled fast in their community, and the sight of multiple police cars with flashing lights had drawn attention. He could see people pointing, whispering behind cupped hands. Some held up phones, probably recording or taking pictures. The weight of their stares made his skin crawl. "Sarah, honey," James spoke into the phone, his voice carefully controlled. "Everything's okay, but something happened at the park with Nathan." No, he's fine, he's right here with me. But I need you to meet us at the station." He paused, listening. "I know, sweetheart, but trust me on this. We need to file a report, and Nathan needs both of us right now." While his father talked, Nathan spotted Mr. Henderson, his history teacher, among the onlookers. The man's usually jovial face was creased with concern as he recognized Nathan. Next to him stood Mrs. Rodriguez from the community center, her hand pressed against her mouth in shock. Nathan wanted to disappear, to somehow make himself invisible to all these watching eyes. "Dad," he whispered, tugging at his father's sleeve. Everyone's staring. James ended the call and surveyed the growing crowd, his jaw tightening. Without a word, he steered Nathan toward his patrol car, opening the front passenger door, a privilege usually reserved for special occasions. As Nathan slid into the seat, he caught fragments of conversation from the nearest group of onlookers. "Mitchell's boy, drunk on duty. Could have been any of our kids." The last comment made James pause as he was closing Nathan's door. Something flickered across his face, a realization that seemed to age him 10 years in an instant. He closed the door gently, then walked around to the driver's side with measured steps that Nathan recognized as his father's thinking walk. Inside the car, the familiar smell of leather and coffee provided a small measure of comfort. Nathan watched as his father settled into the driver's seat, but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, James stared straight ahead through the windshield, his hands resting on the steering wheel. "Nathan," he said finally, his voice soft but intense. "I need you to understand something. What happened today, what Walsh did, it wasn't your fault. Not any of it. And it wasn't just wrong because you're my son. It would have been just as wrong if he'd done it to any other kid." Nathan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. His father continued, "I've spent my whole career trying to build trust between the police and our community. Walsh didn't just betray his badge today. He betrayed everything we're supposed to stand for." James's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "And I promise you, this isn't going to be swept under the rug. Not this time. Not ever." As they pulled away from the park, Nathan caught a glimpse of his reflection in the side mirror. He looked different, somehow older, maybe, or just changed in some indefinable way. The backpack with the now-forgotten lunch sat between his feet, his mom's carefully wrapped sandwich and pie a reminder of how differently this day was supposed to go. The drive to the police station was quiet, but Nathan's mind was anything but silent. He kept replaying the incident, remembering details he hadn't noticed in the moment. The way Walsh's hands had shaken as he held the bottle, the look of desperate anger in his eyes, the sound of his father's footsteps running toward them. Each memory brought new questions, new fears, and new realizations. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Nathan and his father walked through the familiar hallways. Officers who normally greeted them with warm smiles now stepped aside, their faces a mix of concern and something else. Shame, perhaps, or guilt by association. The usual bustle of the precinct had been replaced by a tense silence that seemed to follow them like a cloud. Sarah Mitchell burst through the front doors, just as they reached Captain Mitchell's office, her heels clicking rapidly against the linoleum floor. Her dark hair was escaping from its usual neat bun, and her eyes were wide with worry. "Nathan!" She pulled him into a fierce embrace, and he caught the scent of her familiar lavender perfume mixed with the antiseptic smell of the dental office where she worked. "Baby, what happened?" Before either Nathan or James could answer, Chief Roberts appeared in the doorway of his office. His weathered face was set in grim lines, his silver hair seeming more gray than usual under the harsh lighting. "James, Sarah," he nodded to them both, then looked at Nathan with grandfatherly concern. "Son, are you up for giving a statement? We need to move quickly on this." Nathan felt his mother's arms tighten around him protectively, but his father's steady hand on his shoulder gave him courage. "Yes, sir," he managed, his voice stronger than he expected. "I want to tell you everything." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of statements and paperwork. Nathan recounted every detail he could remember, his voice occasionally faltering but never stopping. His mother's hand remained clasped tightly in his, while his father paced behind them, stopping occasionally to rest a reassuring hand on Nathan's shoulder or to clarify a point for the recording. Detective Maria Santos, whom Nathan knew from the department's youth outreach programs, handled the interview with gentle professionalism. Her dark eyes filled with controlled anger as Nathan described Walsh's actions, but her voice remained calm and encouraging. "You're doing great, Nathan," she would say whenever he hesitated. "Just tell us what you remember." As Nathan spoke, he became aware of movement beyond the office windows. Word had spread quickly, and a crowd was gathering outside the station. Through the Venetian blinds, he could see news vans pulling up, their satellite dishes extending skyward like mechanical trees. "James," Chief Roberts interrupted quietly, gesturing to the growing scene outside. "This is going to break big. We need to get ahead of it." Captain Mitchell nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know, but my family comes first." We finish Nathan's statement, then we deal with the press. Sarah's phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from concerned friends and neighbors. She checked it briefly and inhaled sharply. "James, it's already on social media. Someone from the park posted a video." Nathan's stomach churned at the thought of his terrifying encounter being shared online. But something else caught his attention. Through the office window, he could see familiar faces arriving at the station. Mr. Henderson was there, along with several other teachers from his school. Mrs. Rodriguez had brought what looked like half the community center's youth group. Even old Mr. Winters, who ran the corner store where Nathan Boo, GHD Comic Books, was making his way up the station steps with surprising speed for a man who used a cane. Detective Santos noticed his distraction and followed his gaze. "Looks like you've got quite a support system out there, Nathan," she said softly. "Would you like to take a break?" Nathan shook his head, straightening in his chair. "No, ma'am. I want to finish this." He could feel something changing inside him, a transformation from victim to advocate. The fear was still there, but it was being overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose. People need to know what happened. Not just because it happened to me, but because it could have happened to anyone. His father stopped pacing, and Nathan could see tears in his eyes. Not of sadness or fear, but of pride. Sarah squeezed his hand tighter, and even Chief Roberts seemed to stand a little straighter. "Take your time, son," Chief Roberts said, his voice gentler than Nathan had ever heard it. "Tell us everything. Every detail matters today." As Nathan finished his statement, the murmur of voices outside the station had grown into a steady roar. Through the windows, the crowd had swelled to fill the entire front plaza. Signs had appeared, hastily made but powerful. "Protect our kids. No more abuse of power. Justice for Nathan." The afternoon sun caught the edges of the placards, creating a golden halo around the assembled community members. Chief Roberts stepped out of his office briefly, returning with a grim expression. "The mayor's on her way. This has gone viral, James. The video from the park has over 50,000 views already." He paused, glancing at Nathan. In the comments, people are sharing similar stories. Not just here, but across the state, across the country. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Nathan's school principal. "They're organizing an emergency assembly for Monday," she reported after a brief conversation. "They want to address student safety and police interactions. They're asking if Nathan would be willing to speak." The thought of speaking in front of the whole school made Nathan's stomach clench, but before he could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew everyone's attention. Mayor Eleanor Chin strode into the office, her usual polished appearance slightly disheveled, suggesting she'd dropped everything to come here. "Nathan," she said softly, kneeling beside his chair despite her formal suit. "I am so sorry this happened in our city." Her dark eyes shifted to Captain Mitchell. "James, I need you to know that you have my full support. Whatever changes you think are necessary, whatever resources you need, you have them." The mayor's presence seemed to trigger a shift in the room's energy. Chief Roberts began outlining immediate actions. Walsh's termination proceedings, a department-wide audit of conduct complaints, mandatory psychological evaluations for all officers. Captain Mitchell added his own suggestions, drawing from years of frustrated attempts to implement stricter oversight. Nathan listened, feeling simultaneously exhausted and energized. His father's words from the car echoed in his mind. This isn't going to be swept under the rug. Looking at the determined faces around him, Nathan believed it. Detective Santos returned with printed copies of screenshots from social media. "You might want to see these," she said, spreading them on the desk. Post after post showed people sharing the video, but more importantly, sharing their own stories. A teenager from the next county described being harassed by an officer outside his mosque. A college student recalled being threatened during a routine traffic stop. A grandmother wrote about her grandson's fear of the police after a similar incident. "It's not just about me anymore, is it?" Nathan asked quietly, looking up at his father. James placed both hands on his son's shoulders, meeting his eyes directly. "No, son. It never was. But sometimes it takes one voice to give others the courage to speak up. You did that today." Mayor Chen's phone buzzed with an incoming call. "The governor," she mouthed, stepping aside to answer. Sarah was still fielding messages from concerned parents and community members. Through the window, Nathan could see more news vans arriving, their lights creating a kaleidoscope effect in the gathering dusk. "Dad," Nathan said, his voice stronger now, "I want to speak at the school assembly." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I want to do more. Those people out there, they're not just protesting what happened to me. They're asking for change. Real change." James studied his son's face, seeing not the frightened boy from the park, but a young man coming into his own understanding of justice and responsibility. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need more than just new rules and punishment," Nathan replied, surprising himself with the clarity of his vision. "We need to build trust again, between the police and the community, especially with kids my age." He gestured to the crowd outside. "All these people came here because they care, because they want to help. Maybe we can work with them." Chief Roberts had been listening quietly, but now he stepped forward. "Like a youth advisory council," he suggested, building on Nathan's idea. "Regular meetings between young people and officers. Open dialogue, real accountability. And training," Sarah added, her protective instincts channeling into constructive suggestions. "Not just for the officers, but for kids too. How to stay safe, know their rights, report problems." The energy in the room shifted again from reaction to action. Mayor Chen rejoined them, reporting that the governor wanted to use their city as a model for statewide reforms. Detective Santos was already drafting outlines for new training programs. Through it all, Nathan felt a growing sense of purpose. The fluorescent lights of the police station had dimmed, replaced by the warm glow of sunset streaming through the windows. The crowd outside had grown into something resembling a town meeting, with community leaders taking turns addressing the gathered citizens through makeshift megaphones. Inside, Nathan watched as his simple idea began transforming into concrete action. Mayor Chan had commandeered a conference room, turning it into an impromptu command center. Large sheets of paper covered the walls, filled with flowcharts, timelines, and action items. Nathan's suggestion for a youth advisory council had spawned a dozen related initiatives, each building on the others like pieces of an intricate puzzle. "We need to consider the logistics," Chief Roberts was saying, marking up one of the sheets. "Meeting spaces, schedules that work for both officers and students, training materials." His voice trailed off as he noticed Nathan studying the diagrams intently. "What do you think, Nathan?" the chief asked, genuinely interested in the young man's perspective. "You're our target audience, after all." Nathan stepped closer to the wall, his finger tracing the lines connecting different proposals. "It needs to be real," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Not just meetings where adults talk at us. We need to feel like we're being heard." He turned to face the room, surprised to find everyone listening intently. "And it can't just be the good kids, the ones who already trust the police. We need to reach the ones who are scared, who've had bad experiences." Sarah, who had been taking notes on her tablet, looked up with pride shining in her eyes. "He's right. We need to meet them where they are, physically and emotionally." "The community center," James suggested, snapping his fingers. "It's neutral ground. Mrs. Rodriguez already runs youth programs there. We could start with informal gatherings, build trust gradually." Detective Santos, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward with her own notepad. "I've been compiling statistics from the social media response," she reported. "The stories being shared show clear patterns, specific situations where trust breaks down. We could use that data to design targeted programs." Nathan found himself drawn to a blank section of wall, where someone had written "Bridge the Gap" in bold letters. Below it, empty space waited for ideas. Without thinking too much about it, he picked up a marker and began writing. Movie nights with officers and teens, basketball games and sports tournaments, art projects about community and safety, anonymous suggestion box for concerns, regular coffee with a cop. But for kids, mentorship programs, youth-led training sessions for new officers. His hand moved quickly, thoughts flowing faster than he could capture them. He felt rather than saw others joining him, adding their own ideas, building on his suggestions. The empty space filled with possibilities, each one a potential thread in the fabric of trust they were trying to weave. Nathan, his father's voice was soft but carried across the busy room. Look outside. The crowd had changed. What had started as a protest was evolving into something else entirely. People were forming circles, talking animatedly, sharing ideas. Teachers stood with parents, students with officers, community leaders with concerned citizens. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into determination. Through the glass, Nathan spotted Mr. Henderson organizing a group of his students. They were creating a schedule, probably for the school assembly on Monday. Mrs. Rodriguez moved between groups, her notebook filling with names and numbers. Volunteers ready to help with whatever programs emerged from this evening's planning. "This is how change happens," Mayor Chin said, coming to stand beside Nathan at the window. "Not just through laws and policies, but through people coming together, finding common ground, building something new." The sun had almost set now, but no one seemed ready to leave. The station's parking lot had become an impromptu town square, with someone bringing coffee and sandwiches for the crowd. Nathan saw Officer Johnson, one of the younger cops, sitting cross-legged on the ground with a group of teenagers, listening intently as they shared their experiences and fears. Inside the station, the energy had shifted from planning to action. Detective Santos was setting up a makeshift registration system on her laptop, documenting the flood of volunteers signing up for various initiatives. The conference room had become a buzzing hub of activity, with different groups tackling specific aspects of the emerging community program. "We need to start small but meaningful," James said, reviewing the growing list of proposals. "Show immediate progress while building toward larger changes." He turned to Nathan, who was still adding ideas to the wall. "What do you think should come first?" Nathan stepped back, studying the sprawling web of suggestions. His eyes settled on one of his earlier notes: youth-led training sessions for new officers. "This one," he said, tapping the paper. "But not just for new officers. For all of them." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "They need to hear our stories, understand our perspectives. Not from training manuals or statistics, but from us directly." Mayor Chun, who had been on a series of rapid-fire phone calls with city officials, nodded approvingly. "We could organize a pilot session for next week. The police academy has a new class graduating in 2 months. They could be our first full implementation." The idea sparked immediate action. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had come inside to coordinate with the planning team, began organizing the teenagers who had been sharing their stories outside. Mr. Henderson offered his auditorium for the initial sessions, providing a neutral space that would feel safe for both youth and officers. As the planning continued, Nathan noticed a subtle change in how the officers in the room were interacting with the civilians. The usual professional distance had softened, replaced by genuine engagement. Officer Martinez, a veteran of 15 years, sat with a group of high school students, his notebook open as they described their daily experiences with law enforcement. "You know what's really scary?" one girl was saying, her voice trembling slightly. "When we're just hanging out at the mall, and we see an officer watching us. We're not doing anything wrong, but we feel guilty anyway." Others nodded in agreement, and Martinez wrote furiously, his face a mix of concern and revelation. Sarah, who had been coordinating with other parents, approached Nathan with her tablet. "Look at this," she said, showing him a rapidly growing online forum where community members were sharing resources and organizing support groups. "Your story didn't just start a conversation, it created a movement." The chief of police from the neighboring city had arrived, eager to learn from what was unfolding. He huddled with Chief Roberts and Captain Mitchell, discussing ways to expand the initiative across jurisdictions. Their conversation was frequently interrupted by officers coming forward with their own suggestions and commitments to change. Outside, the impromptu gathering had evolved into an organized community meeting. Someone had brought portable lights, illuminating the parking lot as darkness fell. Groups had formed based on interests and expertise. Educators discussing curriculum changes, social workers planning support services, retired officers offering insights from their experiences. Nathan found himself drawn to a circle of kids his own age, some he recognized from school, others from different parts of the city. They were creating a list of daily situations where they encountered police, walking home from school, playing in parks, gathering at local shops, and discussing how these interactions could be improved. Maybe we could have regular meetups, suggested Tony, a sophomore Nathan knew from the basketball team. Not formal meetings, but like casual hangouts where we can get to know the officers as people. And they can get to know us, added Lisa, a quiet girl from the debate team. Learn our names, our stories, see us as individuals instead of just teenagers. The ideas flowed freely, each suggestion building on the last. Nathan noticed his father watching from the station steps, a mix of pride and determination on his face. James caught his son's eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the transformation they were witnessing. Detective Santos emerged from the station with a stack of freshly printed forms, the first draft of what would become their youth engagement protocol. The parking lot gathering had transformed into multiple focused working groups, each tackling different aspects of the proposed changes. Nathan watched as his initial ideas took on concrete shape through the combined efforts of his community. We've got commitments from 15 officers to start the mentorship program next week, Santos announced, handing the forms to Mrs. Rodriguez. And the chief approved overtime for any officer who wants to participate in the youth programs. The news rippled through the crowd, met with murmurs of approval. Nathan noticed Officer Johnson, who'd been sitting with the teenagers, stand up with renewed purpose. I want to help coordinate the sports program, he volunteered. Used to coach basketball before joining the force. Maybe we could start with some pickup games, make it casual? Several kids immediately perked up at this suggestion. Could we use the community center court? Tony asked, already pulling out his phone to spread the word. My little brother's been scared of cops since he got yelled at for playing ball in the street. This could help him see things differently. Mayor Chun, who had been moving between groups all evening, paused. To observe the spontaneous organization taking place. This is exactly what we needed, she said quietly to Nathan. Not just programs imposed from above, but genuine connections growing from the ground up. Inside the station, the planning room had evolved into a command center for social change. Maps of the city covered one wall, marked with potential locations for youth police interaction programs. Another wall displayed a timeline of implementation, with both short-term actions and long-term goals clearly outlined. Sarah had taken charge of coordinating the parent involvement aspect, her dental office scheduling skills proving invaluable in organizing the various volunteer groups. We need to make sure every neighborhood is represented, she insisted, color-coding different areas of the city. Change has to reach everyone, not just the easy-to-reach communities. James, watching his wife and son work with such dedication, felt a complex mix of emotions. The day's events had started with his worst nightmare, his son in danger, but were ending with unprecedented hope for real change. He approached Nathan, who was deep in discussion with a group of students about their planned presentation for Monday's school assembly. How are you holding up? He asked softly, noting the tired but determined look in his son's eyes. Nathan paused, considering the question. I'm okay, Dad. Better than okay. Actually, he gestured to the activity around them. This morning, I was just trying to bring you lunch. Now, he trailed off, watching as another group of volunteers arrived, carrying boxes of supplies for making posters and information packets. Now you're changing the world, James finished, squeezing his son's shoulder. Not me, Nathan corrected. All of us. Together. He pointed to where Officer Martinez was showing some younger kids his patrol car, explaining how the equipment worked, answering their questions with patience and respect. Look at that. This morning, those kids would have run away if they saw a police car. Now they're learning there's nothing to fear. The night had fully settled in, but the energy showed no signs of diminishing. Someone had ordered pizza for the working groups, and the aroma of food mixed with the sound of productive conversation. Chief Roberts emerged from his office with news that the governor had officially endorsed their initiative, promising state-level support and resources. The pizza boxes were stacked high on makeshift tables as the working groups continued their planning well into the night. Nathan watched as Chief Roberts pinned yet another sheet of paper to the timeline wall, this one outlining the first month of community engagement activities. The enthusiasm was infectious, spreading through the station like wildfire. "We've got confirmation from all 5 high schools," Mr. Henderson announced, hanging up his phone. "They want to implement the new dialogue program immediately. The superintendents are calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning to fast-track the approval." The news brought a fresh wave of energy to the room. Nathan found himself at the center of a group of students and officers, all gathered around a large table where they were mapping out the first youth-led training session. Officer Johnson had brought in his old coaching playbooks, adapting them to create structure. Why and progress went hand in hand. Jasmine's original video had evolved into a documentary series, Bridging the Gap, which followed similar stories of community transformation around the world. Each episode ended with the same message: it's never too late to build a bridge. The banking industry itself had undergone a fundamental shift. The Thompson Protocol, as it came to be known in financial circles, required banks to maintain human-centered services alongside digital options. The result was a banking system that served everyone, regardless of their technological comfort level. 1 year to the day after that morning at the bank, the Thompsons stood in front of their old basketball court, now renovated and renamed the Thompson Community Center. It housed not just sporting facilities, but also a state-of-the-art technology learning center and a bank branch specifically designed to serve elderly customers. "You know what, Sarah?" James said, watching a group of teenagers helping seniors navigate tablet computers under the basketball hoops. "When you walked into that bank a year ago, you thought you were just going to withdraw some money. Instead, you withdrew something much more valuable. You withdrew the power to change the world." Sarah squeezed his hand, watching as Shaq's daughter Jasmine taught a digital banking class to a group of elderly citizens. Her patience and understanding a testament to the bridge their story had built. Rebecca sat nearby, her corporate suit replaced by casual clothes as she chatted with community members. The barriers between institution and individual long since dissolved. The sun set on the community center, its rays catching the new sign that read, "Building Bridges, Breaking Barriers." Inside, the sounds of laughter, learning, and connection echoed off the walls. The story that began with tears had transformed into a symphony of hope, proving that sometimes the greatest changes start with a single moment of human kindness. And in that moment, as Sarah and James watched their legacy unfold before them, they understood that their story had never really been about banking at all. It had been about the enduring power of human connection in an increasingly digital world, a power that, when properly channeled, could build bridges strong enough to keep. Renor's office just called again, Mayor Chin announced, emerging from a private meeting. El curricula. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled up statistics on her tablet, showing the impact of similar perspective-sharing programs in other contexts. Outside, the parking lot gathering had transformed into an organized community forum. Groups were presenting their ideas in turn, each proposal building on the others. The fear and anger that had sparked the initial protest had crystallized into determination and purpose. Nathan watched as a group of younger kids, probably middle school age, took their turn at the makeshift podium. They spoke about their daily walks to school, about the tension they felt when passing patrol cars, about their desire to trust the people meant to protect them. "This is what real change looks like," Mayor Chin said softly, appearing beside Nathan. "Not just policies and procedures, but hearts and minds coming together." The chief's phone buzzed with another message from the governor's office. The state legislature was calling an emergency session to discuss police reform, with a focus on youth interactions. They wanted representatives from this nascent movement to testify. Sarah, who had been coordinating with parent groups across the city, shared her screen with the room. Online forums had exploded with support, with families sharing their own stories and offering to help. The movement was growing beyond their city limits, spreading like ripples in a pond. "We need to document everything," Detective Santos insisted, setting up recording equipment.